It started before they even made it through the front doors. A boy with slicked back hair and a prefect badge leaned against the marble column, eyes scanning them like merchandise. Did the cleaning crew get a dress code upgrade or something? He smirked to his friend, loud enough to echo. Another voice followed. They must have taken a wrong turn, projects are that way. Laughter. By the lockers, a girl with perfect curls and a designer tote whispered to her group without looking, "Did you see their shoes? Like, are those even real Nikes or just survival gear?" Someone behind them snapped a picture and muttered, "Let's see how long they last. Bet they're out before midterms." And when they entered their first class, the teacher paused at roll call. "Imani Blake," he said, then blinked. "Oh, are you two related?" "Of course you are. Twins, huh? You know, we don't usually get many like you here." The class snickered. Imani gritted her teeth. Imara stared ahead. Not because they didn't hear it, but because they had heard it all before. He didn't need to announce himself as the school's golden boy. His presence did it for him. Preston had the swagger of someone born into confidence, a tall, broad-shouldered senior with gelled-back blonde hair and a permanent smirk that said, "This is my kingdom, and you're just passing through." He first approached them on the third day mid-morning in the courtyard, surrounded by his circle of sycophants. His voice rang out just loud enough for the students nearby to hear. "Well, look at that. You two sure took a wrong turn somewhere," he said, arms spread wide in mock surprise. "The servants' entrance is that way." Laughter followed, not because the joke was funny, but because Preston had told it. The gates of Kingsfield Academy opened with a quiet mechanical groan, sleek, modern, and intimidating. For most students, it was just another morning. But for Imani and Imara Blake, it was the first step into a storm they could feel but not yet see. They knew the statistics: less than 3% of the student body was black. And they had heard whispers about the school's legacy culture, where last names held more weight than actual character. But none of that prepared them for the moment they actually walked through those glossy iron gates, their perfectly pressed uniforms gleaming under the morning sun. From the start, they were a spectacle. Not because they were new. Not because they were twins. But because they were different. Because they were black girls in a world built for white wealth and silent compliance. As they stepped onto the pristine courtyard, heads turned not just to look, but to assess. Conversations paused, eyes narrowed, and the air grew colder around them. Imara could feel at first like invisible threads tightening around her shoulders. Imani didn't flinch, but her jaw clenched slightly, her every step deliberate, composed. "Twins," someone muttered from the left, voice dripping with mockery. A boy in a red varsity jacket leaned against the stone pillar, a smirk on his face and arrogance in his posture. His friend next to him let out a sneer, didn't know the admissions office did 2-for-1 deals. Their father had warned them this might happen. Kareem Blake wasn't just a former Marine, he was their sensei, their coach, their anchor. He'd told them, "They'll come at you. Not because of who you are, but because they've already decided who they think you are. That's their mistake. Don't let it become yours." Imani's grip on her backpack tightened. Imara's eyes didn't even shift in their direction. The bond between them didn't need words. They moved forward, back straight, eyes locked on the towering glass doors ahead. Inside the halls, it didn't get better. Teachers called roll without looking up. Students shuffled just enough to force them to walk around, smirking as if the Blakes were ghosts brushing past an invisible line. Every step they took was a reminder they weren't welcome here. But the girls were prepared. They had not been trained to fight for sport. They had trained for control. For discipline. For power over emotion when the world tried to shake it loose. Still, Kingsfield felt different. There was something deeper here, something more sharpened than the usual schoolyard nonsense. This wasn't just teasing. This was warfare by whispers, a constant hum of judgment in every hallway. "They're watching us," Imara muttered, barely above a breath. "I know," Imani replied. Her voice was quiet, but steel-lined. "Let them." By the time they reached their assigned lockers, the tone had been set. There was no welcome committee. No kind smiles. Just tightly wrapped stares and attention so thick it clung to the walls. But the girls didn't falter. They didn't run. They had stepped into the fire with their heads high, and no one, not even the arrogant sneer of a varsity jacket, was going to make them bow. The days that followed were anything but quiet. From the moment Imani and Amara stepped into their first class, they were met not with welcome or curiosity but with precision-engineered coldness. The classroom was bright, the windows tall and polished, and the air smelled of lemon-scented cleaners and privilege. But no amount of shine could mask the way their presence shifted the atmosphere. Teachers called their names flatly, barely making eye contact before moving on. Their questions in class were either ignored or shot down with rushed, dismissive answers. And in the hallways, the crowd parted in subtle but strategic ways, forcing the girls to slow down, step aside, or squeeze through narrow gaps as if they were intruding on space they had no right to occupy. But they didn't respond. They moved like stone through water, silent, steady, and unbending. Every fake smile, every sneer, every accidental shoulder bump followed a script older than the building itself. And at the center of it all was Preston Carmichael. He didn't need to announce himself as the school's golden boy. His presence did it for him. Preston had the swagger of someone born into confidence, a tall, broad-shouldered senior with gelled-back blonde hair and a permanent smirk that said, "This is my kingdom, and you're just passing through." He first approached them on the third day mid-morning in the courtyard, surrounded by his circle of sycophants. His voice rang out just loud enough for the students nearby to hear. "Well, look at that. You two sure took a wrong turn somewhere," he said, arms spread wide in mock surprise. "The servants' entrance is that way." Laughter followed, not because the joke was funny, but because Preston had told it. Imani didn't stop walking. Her eyes stayed forward. But Amara's glance cut sideways, sharp, precise, just long enough to meet Preston's smirk and let it bounce off her silence. Preston wasn't used to being ignored. He thrived on reactions. On discomfort. On power. And now he had found a new target too, actually. In the days that followed, it got worse. Cole and Bryce, Preston's closest friends, joined in. They began a game, bumping into the girls, by accident, knocking their books loose, smirking as papers fluttered across the floor. Each time, they offered an insincere "oops," followed by a chuckle. "Didn't know we let the janitorial staff take algebra now," Cole muttered once, loud enough for others to hear. "Yeah," Bryce added, "maybe they're just here to mop the floors between classes." The cruelty wasn't even clever. But it didn't have to be. Because no one stopped it. Not the students who watched and turned away. Not the teachers who saw the papers scatter but said nothing. Kingsfield Academy had mastered the art of elegant denial, of pretending the ugliness wasn't there if no one dared speak its name. At home, their father noticed. He didn't need his daughters to say a word. He saw it in the way Imani's jaw tightened at dinner, in the extra silence between bites. He saw it in the weight behind Amara's eyes, even when she smiled. He waited. And when they finally spoke, when the silence cracked wide open, he listened. Kareem Blake didn't flinch. He didn't rage. Instead, he reminded them of the lesson etched into every hour they'd spent training in the garage-turned-dojo. "Control," he said, his voice deep but calm, "is everything. They want to get in your heads. Don't let them. They're pushing harder every day," Imani said. "They will," he replied without pause. "They think you'll break. And if they don't stop?" Amara asked. Kareem's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in certainty. "Then," he said quietly, "they'll learn you're not the ones who break." By the end of the second week, the whispers had evolved into words, and the shoves into open confrontation. What started as microaggressions had become bolder, louder, more calculated. Kingsfield Academy was no longer a school hall, it was a chessboard, and the Blakes had been placed on it as pawns to be cornered, humiliated, broken. On Monday morning, Imani and Amara arrived early to avoid the usual crowd. But the ambush was waiting. Their lockers were drenched in red paint, thick streaks across the doors spelling out slurs that burned with hatred. Taped to the vents were crumpled sheets covered in taunts, caricatures with exaggerated features meant to dehumanize. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It was a public lynching without the noose. Around them, laughter broke out, sharp, unfiltered. Dozens of students stood nearby, watching, phones raised, recording. Some laughed openly. Others covered their mouths, pretending to hide amusement. None stepped in. None said a word. And in the center of it all stood Preston, leaning against a row of lockers, arms crossed, eyes gleaming. "Figured we'd give you some decorations," he called out smugly. "You know, to make you feel more at home." The crowd erupted. The sound echoed through the hallway like thunder, loud, ugly, and relentless. Imara's hands curled into fists. Her breath shook. Imani stood rigid, her face unreadable, but the fire behind her eyes blazed like an inferno barely contained. This was no longer bullying. This was warfare. And everyone was watching. For a moment, the air froze as Mr. Henley, a history teacher, stepped into the hall. He stopped, saw the mess, the crowd, the tension thick as smoke, and turned away. He turned away. That was the moment something inside the Blake twins cracked, not in a way that broke them, but in the way steel cracks before it reforges. They didn't cry. Didn't scream. They picked up the paper towels offered by the janitor who couldn't meet their eyes and wiped the paint off their lockers with silent, deliberate strokes. And when it was clean, Imani spoke. "Enough." Her voice was low, steady, but carried weight like a hammer falling onto stone. Imara turned to her, her chest heaving. "No more games," she said. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, an understanding. The storm they'd held back was now coiled inside them, waiting. And the next time Preston stepped forward, they wouldn't walk away. The next day, the school pulsed with anticipation. Whispers buzzed through the halls like static. Phones were passed hand to hand, showing screenshots of the defaced lockers, videos of Imani and Imara wiping the paint off without a word. But it wasn't admiration they received, it was bloodlust. Students weren't asking if the twins would fight back. They were waiting for it. Preston arrived early. He wanted an audience. He stood near the entrance of the east courtyard, sunglasses on, tie loose, his usual smug entourage of Cole and Bryce flanking him. They weren't laughing today. They were grinning like wolves. And right on time, Imani and Imara came into view, side by side, walking with the same quiet precision they always had. "There they are," Preston announced loudly, as if on a stage. "Was worried you two might have transferred to somewhere, less challenging." Imani didn't break stride. "If that's what you call yourself, I'm disappointed," she said coolly. The crowd murmured. A ripple of, "Oh," swept across the courtyard. Preston's smirk twitched. "You've got a mouth," he snapped, stepping forward. "You really think you belong here?" Imara answered before her sister could. "We don't think," she said calmly, eyes locked on his. "We know." That was the moment the switch flipped. Preston lunged forward and shoved Imani hard. She staggered a step back, but caught herself easily, feet firm. Gasps erupted. Then silence. Bryce, emboldened, swatted Imara's books out of her hands. They scattered across the concrete like confetti. "Maybe you should go cry to Daddy now," Cole mocked, and shoved Imara in the shoulder. That was the line. Imani's voice was like flint striking steel. "We're done running." She stepped forward, palm striking Preston's chest with practiced force, sharp, efficient, stunning him backward with a gasp. Imara dropped into a stance, swept Cole's legs out from under him, sending him crashing. The courtyard exploded. Gasps, shouts, phones whipped out. Preston lunged again, swinging wild. Imani ducked beneath the punch and drove her fist into his ribs. He collapsed to one knee, wheezing. Bryce charged. Imara caught his arm mid-swing and flipped him over her shoulder with the grace of a dancer and the control of a soldier. The Blake twins moved as one, a hurricane of skill and purpose. They didn't fight out of rage. They fought because this was the line, and it had been crossed. And now everyone watching finally understood. These girls weren't the victims anymore. The courtyard wasn't the same after the fight. Where laughter once rang without fear, now a strange, heavy silence hung in the air. Students lingered on the edges, whispering with wide eyes, glancing toward the spot where Preston had been knocked flat, where Bryce had hit the pavement groaning, where Cole had been flipped like a rag doll. No one cheered. No one clapped. Because what had happened wasn't some petty scuffle. It was a reckoning. The teachers arrived late, too late, and not because they hadn't heard the commotion. They had. But no one wanted to be the first adult to step into a storm they had ignored for weeks. Mr. Henley, the history teacher who had turned away the day before, showed up with Principal Harding just as Imani and Imara stood tall in the middle of the crowd. Their breathing was steady. Their posture upright. The bruises on the boys around them told the story. "What is going on here?" Harding barked, though the scene explained itself. Before either twin could respond, Preston coughed from the ground. "They attacked us," he gasped, clutching his ribs. "We were just talking." It was a weak lie, one so paper-thin, even the nearby students flinched. But the silence said it all. No one defended him. No one backed him up. Imani's voice was calm, clear. "They've been targeting us since we arrived. We didn't throw the first blow. But we threw the last." Principal Harding's eyes darted between the twins, the crowd, and the injured boys. Something flickered in his gaze, recognition, maybe. Or guilt. "You three," he said sharply, pointing at the twins and Preston, "my office. Now." The crowd parted. As the girls walked forward, every step was deliberate, every breath under control. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they refused to let fear write their story. Inside the administrative wing, the walls were colder. The headmaster's office was stiff and silent. Imani and Imara sat side by side, their eyes forward. Across from them, Preston sat hunched over, flanked by Bryce and Cole nursing their bruises, faces twisted with pain and panic. Then the door opened. Kareem Blake stepped in. Their father didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He looked at his daughters first, checked their eyes, not for injury, but for steadiness. He nodded once. Then he turned to the principal. "I'm here," he said quietly, "because you failed to protect my daughters. And now we're going to fix that." The air inside Principal Harding's office was taut with tension. Imani and Imara sat side by side, eyes steady, hands resting on their laps. Kareem stood behind them like a shadow forged in steel, calm, silent, immovable. Across the room, Preston slouched in his chair, arms crossed over his bruised chest, while Bryce and Cole whispered nervously to each other. Then the door burst open. Elaine Carmichael, Preston's mother, entered like a force of nature. Diamond earrings glinting. Heels clicking like gunfire against the floor. Her tailored navy suit screamed influence. Her expression screamed something colder, entitlement. Behind her, Douglas Carmichael followed. Broad-shouldered. Jaw tight. Red-faced with rage before a single word was spoken. "This is outrageous," Elaine said sharply. "My son has been assaulted. Beaten. And I expect real consequences." Kareem didn't move. Didn't blink. Elaine's eyes landed on Imani and Imara, lips curling. "Those two are a problem," she hissed, turning to Principal Harding. "Expel them. Now. Before this becomes a PR nightmare." Imara raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Harding cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carmichael, there's more to this than." "No," Douglas snapped. "There's not. We donate thousands to this school. We sit on the board. And we won't stand by while our son is humiliated by some." He didn't finish the sentence. The weight of what he was going to say hung in the air like poison. That's when Kareem stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Say it." Douglas turned, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "I said say it," Kareem repeated, voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You came here ready to swing, so go ahead. Say what you've been choking on." The room went still. Imani and Imara didn't move. Didn't speak. But their presence filled the space behind their father like a storm building in silence. Elaine blinked first. "We are trying to resolve this professionally," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. Kareem nodded once. "Professionally," he said. "Then let's talk about the professionalism of your son. The video evidence of the slurs. The vandalism. The silence of this administration. Let's talk about what really happened here." Principal Harding shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elaine bristled. "You think we don't know how this works? We can bury this story before it gets out." Kareem leaned in slightly. "Maybe," he said. "But you'll have to bury the truth too. And that never stays buried long." The office fell into a heavy, brittle silence. Principal Harding finally spoke. "There will be a full investigation. Suspension for all parties until further notice." Elaine looked like she might explode. But Kareem didn't flinch. He placed a hand on each of his daughter's shoulders. "We'll be ready," he said softly. "And this time, the whole truth will come with us." The suspension notice was cold, clinical, printed on a single sheet of paper with Principal Harding's signature at the bottom. But what it carried was far heavier, a message not of fairness, but of fearful compromise. The school wasn't ready to admit it had failed. Not yet. So it did what most institutions do when cornered. It chose neutrality. But Kareem Blake didn't believe in neutrality when harm had a name. At home, Imani and Imara sat across from their father at the dinner table, not in defeat, but in quiet preparation. Their bruises were fading, but the fire in their chests was only growing. The house was calm, almost too calm. As if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Do you think they'll bury it?" Imara asked quietly. Kareem didn't answer right away. He reached over, opened his laptop, and turned the screen toward them. It was paused on a frame from a security camera. Imani leaned in. Her eyes narrowed. It was the locker hallway, the paint, the taunts, the students laughing. "How did you get this?" she whispered. "An old friend," Kareem said. "I used to train the district's head of facilities in my academy." He sent it off the record. "There's more." Click. The next frame showed Bryce bumping into Imara. Cole swatting her books. Preston blocking their path. The same smirk, again and again. Over days. Weeks. Time-stamped. Archived. Unedited. And the final video? The fight. But not the version the school had. This footage came from a student's phone, a friend of a friend who had once laughed along but had gone silent after seeing the rage in Preston's eyes during the attack. She had recorded the whole thing. From the first shove, to the final blow. Imani's breath caught. Imara leaned back, arms crossed, her voice low. "They can't deny it now." Kareem nodded. "But we're not just sending it to the school," he said. "We're sending it to everyone who needs to see it." The next morning, the videos began to spread. Anonymous uploads to parent forums. Private links sent to school board members. Whispered shares among teachers. Students watched on their phones between classes. At first, there was hesitation. Then silence. Then murmurs. Then outrage. Because what the footage showed was not just violence. It showed neglect. Complicity. A system that stood still while children were targeted. And slowly one by one people began to speak. First was Mr. Laramie, the science teacher. He had seen Cole shove Amara once, weeks ago. He hadn't said anything. But now, he wrote an email to Harding and blind copied half the faculty. Then came Mrs. Sanchez, a cafeteria worker who had overheard the slurs during lunch and had been told to let it go. And then came the students. One anonymous post after another on the school's Reddit thread. I saw Preston write on the locker. I didn't stop him. I was there when they tripped Amara. I laughed. I'm not proud. I knew. We all knew. And we stayed quiet. The silence cracked. And then it broke. At the next school board meeting, the crowd spilled into the hallway. Parents, teachers, reporters. The room buzzed with tension. Cameras clicked. Notebooks filled. Principal Harding sat at the center tight, lips drawn. His eyes met Kareem's briefly across the room. Kareem sat beside his daughters, files in a neat folder on his lap. He didn't bring rage. He brought evidence. One by one, Kareem laid it out. The surveillance. The screenshots. The witness statements. Each page a nail in the coffin of denial. When he finished, he looked up at the board. You didn't just fail my daughters, he said. You failed this entire student body. You made silence safer than truth. But not anymore. The room went still. And then applause. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just steady. From teachers. From students. From parents who had once stayed silent. Elaine and Douglas Carmichael weren't in attendance. They had hired lawyers. But their absence only amplified their guilt. Preston was no longer the prince of the school. He was a name on a disciplinary docket pending expulsion. And the Blake sisters? They weren't suspended anymore. They were heard. It wasn't over the moment the board meeting adjourned. But something had shifted. The next morning, the courtyard of Kingsfield Academy felt different. Not louder. Not bolder. Just clearer. Imani and Amara walked through the front gates like they always had, side by side, heads held high, but now, something followed behind them that hadn't been there before. Respect. No more mocking stares. No more whispered insults. Students who had once turned away now nodded silently as they passed. Some with guilt. Others with quiet solidarity. And when they stepped into the main hallway, even the faculty greeted them, by name, with eye contact, as if only now realizing who they'd been ignoring all along. Change had begun. But change demanded more than silence. A week later, Principal Harding, under pressure from the board, from public opinion, and from his own conscience, called a special assembly. Every student, every teacher, every staff member filled the auditorium. On stage were 2 empty chairs. Until Imani and Amara took their seats. And when they stood, the entire auditorium went silent. Imani stepped up to the mic. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't angry. She was composed. We didn't ask to be symbols, she said, voice steady. We didn't want to become some story told in whispers. We just came here to learn like everyone else. A beat of silence. But we were met with silence. And silence is where injustice hides. She paused, let the words sink in. Imara followed, her voice low but razor sharp. Every time someone looked away, every time someone stayed quiet, they helped build the wall we had to break through. She looked out at the sea of students. We didn't break it alone. Some of you helped tear it down. And now that it's cracked, we don't let it get rebuilt. Applause began, not thunderous, but steady. This time, it wasn't for spectacle. It was for truth. In the weeks that followed, Kingsfield Academy changed because it had to. The Carmichaels withdrew their son. Bryce and Cole were expelled. A third-party equity audit was launched. A new anti-bullying task force was created with 2 student advisors named Imani and Amara Blake. Anonymous reporting tools were added. Teachers were required to take bias awareness training. Posters were removed. New ones went up. Ones that didn't just talk about diversity, but accountability. And on a bright Monday morning, just 3 months after the locker defacing incident, Imani and Amara were invited back to that same stage, this time, not as victims. Not even as survivors. But as leaders. They stood before incoming freshmen, most of whom had only heard about what happened in pieces, and told the full truth. Not for sympathy. Not for applause. But to make sure no one else had to go through it again. As they stepped down, they saw something in the eyes of the crowd, not fear. Not pity. But fire. And as they walked side by side across the courtyard, now filled with students who saw them clearly, they didn't smile out of triumph. They smiled out of peace. Because they hadn't just endured injustice. They had transformed it.